Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation podcast network.
I think going back to that idea of finding balance in your life, it's tough. And I've made mistakes along the way, especially in the early parts of my career. And when I'm doing something that's really exciting for me, I've over-indexed on work and ended up suffering the consequences of that and not having balance. So a practice that I've really started is operating way ahead of deadlines and pushing things much earlier and making sure I have someone who always knows what's going on my team or in my orbit who can sit in for me if something were to happen.
Welcome to Talking Head Pain, the podcast that confronts head pain head on. I'm your host, Joe Coe, Director of Therapeutic Area Growth and Integration at the Global Healthy Living Foundation, as well as Co-President of GHLF Canada. I've been a migraine patient for over 20 years, so I know firsthand how debilitating this disease can be. I'm here today with Izac Ross, who has been living with migraine since he was a child. He is the founder of the Haven Headache Migraine Center, a new virtual first clinic in California. You can also find him on Instagram by going to the handle Gay with a Headache. How are you doing today, Izac?
I'm doing good, recovering from a bit of a bad migraine weekend, but really glad to be on the podcast.
So let's jump in with that. It wasn't a pre-planned question, but what did your migraine look like during the weekend?
Yeah, so funnily enough, I was down in Southern California with the whole team, all 7 of us, Haven Headache and Migraine Center. And it was just such an exciting week that I had the classic letdown headache when I came back on Sunday and just laid up in bed and had a few, unfortunately, my least favorite migraine symptom of throwing up, but doing much better now. And just that classic like migraine hangover, which I think for people without migraine is probably the best way of describing it. Like you had 8 drinks the night before and have to function the next day.
Izac, I remember having a migraine attack. I was in the hospital, not for me. I was visiting my grandmother, and the bright lights in the hospital triggered something, and I felt really sick. And I said, let me leave the hospital. I walked into town where the hospital was and went to a donut place to get a coffee. And I couldn't speak. I lost my words for a moment. It felt like a long time. It probably wasn't. And when I was able to ask for the coffee, the person was looking at me like I was strange. And they were like, oh, what's going on? And I was like, oh, I just had a rough night, And I was like, I was out the night before. Instead of saying I had migraine, because this young barista would understand a hangover, but I didn't feel like educating folks on aphasia and all the things that could happen with migraine. So yeah, I totally understand that feeling, Izac.
That's so real. I think that's such a big part of the experience of having migraine or any sort of disability that makes you a little different, that's invisible, is the experience of masking and figuring out how to navigate social situations when you're not doing that great.
Totally. So when we were talking before the podcast, you shared with me a bit about your migraine history and being so young with migraine. Can you explain what that was like as a child living with migraine?
Yeah. So I was diagnosed at age 2, which was back in 1990. And getting diagnosed with pediatric migraine that early was really rare back then, but had some classic signs even before I was speaking, that I was photophobic very often outside. I was grinding my head into the carpet, crying and having excessive crying fits that my parents couldn't figure out. And I was blessed with the genetic cesspool of 2 parents with migraine, so I was pretty hopeless to escape without it. But luckily, we were living in UCLA at the time, which had and still does have one of the best pediatric neurology practices, and got diagnosed as soon as I could really speak and articulate what was going on. But back then, like the triptans didn't exist. Like nothing existed really for rescue medications other than sort of some barbiturates and opioids and anti-seizure medications back then. But as a kid, that was really isolating, right? Socially, I could not do as much as my friends and my classmates, and was out of school at least one day a week on and off during different years. I think everyone with migraine who's a chronic sufferer knows that there are good years and bad years. There's ebbs and flows in your condition, but very isolating. And I was very lucky and not lucky to also have dyslexia severe enough that I was able to go to smaller special needs schools that were more catered than a standard public school. And that really helped me navigate and also in some ways learn to navigate and advocate for myself for both my dyslexia and my migraine, because to be successful in college and later in life, I had to learn how to do that pretty quickly.
Thank you for sharing that part of your history. Let's push forward to the current day and your personal experience pushing for what some call migraine freedom. I had a doctor on last week who discussed that concept, or the idea of crystal clear days with migraine. Are you there? And if you are there, how did you get there?
Yeah, I can't say that I'm always there, but I have months and like whole seasons where I'm there. And at Haven, our kind of words for this are more good days, and how we talk about this and what we aspire for all our patients to have. Because for a lot of folks, complete remission is just not a thing. I think we'll be getting there with some of the new treatments that are in the pipeline over the next 5 years, but we're not there yet. But been completely changed in the last 15 years. For me, we talked about the ebb and flow of like good times and bad times. And I was really lucky to graduate college at a time right as Botox for migraine was finally FDA approved, and got it just as I was entering the workforce. And that was the first time where I experienced the crystal clear days a lot more often, and had a great sort of 6 years up until 2016 when I had another sort of setback or bad year and ended up in the ER with one of the worst headaches I had had since I was a kid. And from that point, ended up with a daily status headache that just would not go away, which modulated between a low grade and a high grade migraine. And there was a gap between 2016 and 2018 when the new class of CGRP meds came out, where I was trying everything, where I tried ablations of the occipital nerve. I tried DHE hospitalizations, which temporarily broke this headache, but nothing really helped until these like miraculous drugs. I know they don't work for everyone, but I was very lucky to get on the first CGRP inhibitor very early, I think in June of 2018. And it took about 3 months to fully get working. But once it was working, it really broke that headache and got me back to having the crystal clear or more good days feeling. And that medication, plus me being very lucky to also be able to access Botox at the same time, changed my life completely. It was the most clear days I've ever had. And the longer I've been on it, with some exceptions, the trajectory has been pretty good. There's been bad months, but my overall pathway has been great. And I've been able to do things that I've always wanted to do, which just weren't possible before. A great example of this is like I did AIDS Life Cycle, which is a bike ride from San Francisco to LA. If I were to do that before the CGRP meds, I would have triggered a migraine if I was just mildly dehydrated. And I would experience that on that ride. And I have been able to be more social. I learned that I'm actually an extrovert, where turns out it's just my migraines that make me an introvert, and able to do things like go to 30 music shows a year, which is my passion, and like not miss, for the most part, the shows I want to go to. They've really just completely changed my life, and really want to spread that to more people.
It's amazing. What were some of the highlights of the shows that you went to in the past year?
Oh my gosh. Okay. Beyonce, first off, that was amazing. And then my true diva is James Murphy of LCD Sound System. I've seen him twice this year. Just amazing. And Janelle Monáe.
I see your vibe. Really, that's really important that we find things that bring us joy and that we don't settle so we can experience that. And that ties into my next question. Why do you advocate for people and yourself to not settle for subpar treatment and to find the right treatment plan for them or for you?
I think one, just segueing into that, I think it's really important that what makes life worth living is following your passions. And so many things with migraine prevent that. And it's so important to advocate not just to make it through your migraines, but actually have a life outside of your experience as a chronic migraine patient. And I think doctors and other people in your surrounding often will give you guilt for going out and doing these things that make life worth really being a joy. And I think every person deserves to go do those things, go see Beyonce if that's the thing that you love, or go out dancing with your friends at night. It's not just about protecting your head. And I think really making and talking about what your goals are with your doctor and having them be somewhat realistic, but, not always in the affirmant shell of the experience of having a migraine is important to your mental health and your physical health. So pushing for that is really important. And sometimes that means pushing past your current provider and finding the right provider, which is so hard, especially if you're outside of a major metropolitan area. And this is what's so exciting about what's sort of changing in headache medicine is the studies around virtual care that happened in the pandemic show that the outcomes of receiving virtual care for migraine are exactly the same as in person, which I think is really going to be the future of headache medicine, is sort of a hybrid approach of finding your expertise virtually and then getting any sort of hands-on patient stuff locally.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it segues into almost my last question for you today. You are building and have built a very successful career. You're an entrepreneur. How do you do that living with a chronic disease like migraine?
I'm going to say it's not easy. I mean, I think going back to that idea of finding balance in your life, it's tough, especially for me going into a new position where I'm the CEO of a company. A totally different set of responsibilities than I've had in the past. And part of my role right now is actually to take care of myself so I can grow this business. And I've made mistakes along the way, especially in the early parts of my career. And when I'm doing something that's really exciting for me, I've over-indexed on work and ended up suffering the consequences of that and not having balance. So I think one key is trying to figure out what your limits are and making sure you're never hitting them. I think the other aspect is, and this is unfortunate, is like people with a chronic condition have to be so much more hyper-performing than their peers because they don't know when they're going to be out of the office. So a practice that I've really started is operating way ahead of deadlines and pushing things much earlier and making sure I have someone who always knows what's going on my team or in my orbit who can sit in for me if something were to happen. That means I actually have a lot more work to do than those folks who don't suffer from these conditions. But I think it's also prepared me a lot more as an entrepreneur to give away my Lego bricks faster, which is a big thing that comes up as you're growing a company, is to let other people eventually take over your responsibilities. And that is very hard in the early part of your career, but actually makes you a better leader later in your career, where you're going to have to depend on your team a lot of the time to be able to execute on things. And for me, in the role that I'm on now, hiring people that I really trust and can empower is what's enabling me to do this. It also doesn't hurt me right now that I have 5 excellent headache specialists in my orbit, which is a rarity that no one else will probably ever experience in their life. But before that, I didn't have any of that. So this is the first time where I literally have people that I'm talking to every day who are headache specialists. But in the early part of my career, working early, telling people what's on your plate and being able to call out because you have that are really important.
I'm laughing in my head about, it's like Izac knows a guy, but that's like a very New York vibe and feeling, not California.
I spent 3 years in New York. I know a guy.
One thing that I wanted to circle back on and just underscore with that statement was that I think our community and audience can relate to a lot is the idea of having to overperform to compensate for the bad days so we feel like we're productive, particularly the way that we value productivity in our society. We are defined by our jobs and our roles and the output that we give. And we hear a lot from people with chronic disease these invisible conditions, the not feeling like they're a valuable part of society or that their output matters, and how to balance that as individuals that are able to work. And it's something I've struggled with. I thought I was going to go into politics for a while. I'm not. I hope I'm not. But I didn't want to necessarily disclose or be very open about having migraine or other chronic diseases because I'm like, will they say if I ran for office that he can't really be present for constituents or he's not totally performing because he has, a headache? So that was something when I was younger that I thought a lot about. I don't anymore. I feel much more secure in my position and role, both, in work, in society, and in myself. But it's important for us to hear that even the people that look like where it's easy and we just have it all together and we're doing it, or there's a lot of background stuff that's happening. So I'm glad that you shared some of that background stuff.
Yeah. And just to add to that, I think this is a lesson that I've learned more from my other disability, which is dyslexia. Because if you read my email, you can tell early. But this is a lesson that I've had to learn is that I need to disclose both very early to my employers. I don't do it in the hiring process, but I do it very early within my first month of working with a new manager. And I think what's really important for everyone to know is it is actually a manager's responsibility, not HR's responsibility, to provide reasonable accommodations. And if you don't disclose, you could get yourself into hot water really quickly, especially if you're more on the chronic side. And it's really scary to do so. And it may take some education and actually talking about what the headache phases look like with your manager and how them be read into your condition. But the best relationships I've formed are when I have done that really, really early and would really recommend advocating for yourself. Going back to your career in politics, that's actually what I thought I would do if I didn't go into this weird career in tech. And I, as a West Wing super fan and kid who grew up in DC, I'm really excited to go to Headache on the Hill for the first time this year and advocate in front of the Congress folks for California. So I'm just really psyched for that. I don't know if you're doing it.
Amazing. No, I was, but I had a conflict, unfortunately. But two of my colleagues, Sarah Shaw and JP, will be there, and my legislators know me. So I make sure that they know what matters to us. My last question for you. You just launched Haven Headache and Migraine Center. What is it and why does it matter to folks and why did you do it?
Thank you so much for that question. So my whole career has been in the intersection of user experience and healthcare. And for the last kind of 4 years, I've been thinking about when's the time to work on this for migraine, and went to World Migraine Summit and just saw the relief. I think this was in 2021 of headache doctors and the excitement of how they were thinking about the future of headache treatment. And I was like, okay, this is the time to do this. And the whole reason why I want to start Haven Headache and Migraine Center is I am an expert in healthcare. I was an early employee at a startup health insurance company. I know how to navigate the system like no one else can. And it took me a year in my moment of crisis in 2016 to get in to see someone in the Bay Area who was an actual specialist because I was doing pretty well. I was just seeing a general neurologist. And that should not be the case. Everybody deserves access to amazing headache care. And even people who have access to UCSF, Stanford, or UCLA, they're not there in a moment of crisis. You cannot get a hold of your doctor if you need an infusion. Your ass is in the ER, excuse my language. And that is a horrible experience. And I wanted to design and build a headache and migraine center literally around that moment of crisis, which is what we are doing. And it's so exciting. We have launched in Southern California, in LA, OC, and San Diego for in-person care, but we're virtual throughout California. And we have our open wait list right now, but we're going to start seeing our first patients at the end of January. Whenever this comes out, hopefully should be open and seeing patients, but we're trying to get folks in within 2 weeks. And unlike your typical headache center that tells you to fill out a paper diary and nothing gets done with it until you show up in the next visit, we have an interactive diary that we are monitoring on the back end. So if you have 48 hours of headache, we're going to reach out to you with a solution on what to do. and what your next step should be. And if you ever need help, we're available during business hours to troubleshoot your care plan and work with you. Right now, to be able to afford to do that, we are charging a $35 per month access fee on top of your insurance copays when you see our clinicians. But our hope is through clinical studies to get our remote monitoring covered for patients with migraine.
It's amazing. Congratulations. Really excited for you and happy to hear that there's something new out there for our friends in California.
And we have an amazing clinical team of headache specialists, and more are coming on board soon. I can't disclose that quite yet, but you can check us out and join the waitlist at havenheadache.com. And we'd love, if you're in California, to see you. And if you're not, demand in other states tells us where we're going to open up next. So we're hoping to expand into other states later in the year.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to connect with me today. Really appreciate it.
Of course, glad to be on.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Talking Head Pain, the podcast that confronts head pain head on. If you have any questions, thoughts, or suggestions for us, you can send us an email at podcast@ghlf.org. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it an honest 5-star rating, write a positive review, and spread the word by sharing it with your friends and family. It'll help more people like you find us. I'm Joe Coe, and I will see you next time.
Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation Podcast Network.